Hey, so in this video, I'm going to talk to you about um, sort of how society changes over time. I am recording now in a classroom in Rock Valley College downtown campus, and I didn't know that my shirt was going to match the wall. Um, so that's weird. And I have this whiteboard behind me, but I think that you're getting a reverse image. So I'm still not going to use that one. I'll use the weird one that's sitting in front of me. And maybe one of these days I'll tell you why I use whiteboards instead of slides, but maybe not important. Anyway, sorry for wasting your time. This I want to talk about this idea that society changes over time. But first, now that we've defined culture, we can actually define society. Like, what is sociology trying to do? Your book gives you a good definition, a group of people who live in a definable community and share the same cultural components. Essentially, it's a group of people who share a culture and share a territory. Oftentimes, we think about that in terms of national boundaries, but it doesn't have to be a national boundary. It can be the boundaries of organizational membership, for instance. It could be a group. It doesn't have to be a large population, but a group. Something that shares a territory or a set of boundaries and shares a culture is what we define as society. I'm going to try to do that cool thing again where I show you some video that you can watch. There's this movie that I absolutely adore called Babies. It's a documentary that came out where the filmmakers followed these four babies from the time that they were born until they were 1 year old. And it was too hard to sort of get them not to pay attention to the camera anymore. But they're in four places around the world. They are in America. They're in Japan, or I should say the United States of America. They're in Japan, they're in Mongolia, and they're in Namibia. So four very different places in the world. And when you watch this movie, you can see these very, very different societies, these very different sets of cultural practices, very different types of environments. And the important thing about it is that it's all done contemporaneously. But the truth is that our ethnocentrism or our own arrogance of our own time and our own space, it looks like some of these other societies are sort of, we would say words like underdeveloped or behind the times or like somewhere stuck somewhere. But these are their places, their territories, their cultures. In this video, one, again, I told you I super love babies. But what it does is allow us to see how we come to learn and understand and share in those cultural practices. Societies change over time. They always have, and they always will. And so this next chapter, it's chapter 4, where we talk about things like social interaction and the construction of reality, deals with the question of how do societies change over time. And I think that your book does a really good job this time. I'm not criticizing our textbook at this point in talking about some of those differences. And just like I said it would, it gives you those responses by looking at structural functionalism. What would they say? How does society change over time? How do social conflict theorists say society is changing over time? And how do symbolic interactionists say that society is changing over time? So I won't go into a lot of detail, but I do want to point your attention to a couple things. If we look at Durkheim, for instance, Durkheim is interested in those divisions of labor, particularly at a time when we've moved from agricultural, very farm-based societies to more central urban places. And he says sort of the idea that people create their solidarity, social solidarity, and how we're relating to one another in these structural spaces is how society is changing over time. So your book goes into some description of mechanical solidarity, which is a type of social order maintained by collective consciousness of a culture. In other words, we're the same. We all do the same thing. We have all the same tasks. We've always done it this way. We maintain solidarity sort of in an automatic mechanical way. The goal, however, he would say, is organic solidarity when we have social order based on economic and social differences. We become interdependent. Instead of us you know, connecting with one another because we're the same. You do what you do, I do what I do, and we figure out how to work together. I remember we're talking centralized urban places. There's factories and large industries and much more differentiation in the kinds of things that people do. We need accountants and lawyers and, secretaries and administrators and laborers and everybody's doing all kinds of things. So the goal is to get to this kind of organic solidarity, this differentiation. And he suggests that societies are trying to move in that way. Um, a collective conscience is just general shared beliefs and morals and attitudes about a society. It's important for us to feel integrated, to feel like we belong. That solidarity, that question of solidarity, is what structural functionalists would look at, based on sort of the thoughts of Emile Durkheim. Social conflict theorists, again, they're going to challenge everything that a structural functionalists would say. Karl Marx, in this criticism of capitalism, says that social change happens through revolution. In particular, that capitalists are going to be focused on their own wealth development, their own profit. They're not going to be concerned with the greater good of a society. And instead of sort of this collective conscience, he's challenging a false consciousness. He essentially says a false consciousness, this is what the book definition gives you. It's a condition in which beliefs, ideals, and ideology of a person are not in that person's best interest. He's saying this sort of collective conscience that you have really is a false consciousness. You're sort of falling for this ethic of hard work, this potential for economic mobility later. You're participating in this competition ideology over cooperation, thinking that there's a place for you in this kind of society. He challenges that false consciousness and says, your book points out, you need to be concerned with your class consciousness. Figure out and be very concerned with your actual place in society. It's awareness of your rank in society, because the capitalists are not interested in the greater good. So if you want to change, if society gets better, if society moves forward, then we're going to have to stage a revolution. We're going to have to, explode or get rid of this capitalist stuff. This is in this thought where he talks about, you've heard the phrase, religion is the opiate of society. And that's it's a paraphrase, it's a translation, clearly. But what he's saying is that religion, these kind of ethical ideas that we're supposed to focus on wealth building and hard work and always trying to get forward and move forward. That's just kind of trying to soothe us into maintaining this false consciousness when what we need to be is much more aware. Symbolic interactionists, remember, we kind of pay attention in foundations to what Max Weber would say. And he says that society is moving forward. Society is generally going to move forward on the basis of our ideas. We're trying to be better by coming up with more efficient and more rational ways to do things. The search for better ideas. He talks about this idea of rationalization, that modern society is built around logic and efficiency, not morality and tradition. But he also warns of what he ultimately calls the iron cage of capitalism, for instance, that we get so efficient, that we get so logical in the way that we do things, that we forget to pay attention to the time that we might have with our family, for instance. We don't cook anymore and spend the time in our kitchens because, in our society, for instance, we hurry up and we get fast food. That's the more logical thing to do. That's the more efficient thing to do. So sometimes you can get so logical and so efficient as a society that you create this iron cage. You're kind of just stuck in the way that things are happening instead of sort of living. And maybe you're not getting better. You're just sort of getting more stuck and maybe even standing still. So those are the ways that our three main sociological thought buckets will talk about change in society. But, that's what we talk about in sociology. The one that we kind of recognize, even outside of an intro to sociology course, is society is changing through just technological advances. And remember, technology doesn't have to be mechanical, it doesn't have to be electrical, it doesn't have to be digital. Technology is the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. So anything that we learn better about, if we can use that knowledge to make our lives better, that's technology. So a washing machine was big technology, refrigerators, big technology, just like a smartphone or a tablet is big technology. A pencil is big technology. Before we had pencils, we had to learn about the way that lead or graphite writes or makes these marks. And then we had to figure out how to make paper. Like all of these things are technological advances. Gerard Lenski, that's who we get this idea of watching technological advances as the push towards society's change. And your book gives you, again, a really good description of this shift or change from hunter-gatherer societies to pastoral and agrarian societies to agricultural societies, which we really talk about sort of like the dawn of civilization. Again, because this time between agricultural societies and industrial societies, where we're developing this great big amount of technological capabilities, means that we create for people a lot more free time. We create for people a lot more time to just be settled in one place and not have to follow crop growth or not have to follow, where the livestock go, that's where we go. And so you get to be more permanent. You get to develop more cities. You get to develop more. That permanent settlement means that, for Durkheim, you get to be more differentiated in your labor, more specialized. That organic solidarity for him was the goal. But for Linsky, same thing. It's the dawn of civilization when we get into these agricultural societies instead of horticultural and pastoral societies where we're just not really as settled. And then after the industrial society, we move into these post-industrial societies like we are now, more service-based and more information and attention-based. Again, way more detail in the book about that shift through technology. But what I want to point out, especially when we think about the differences in how these three main sociological perspectives think about it in comparison with this more common focus on technological advances. And that babies movie, when we watch that clip, I do encourage you to watch that clip, is that societies don't change at the same rate around the world. So when we look at our post-industrial society and compare it to an agricultural society, for instance, they're not stuck in the past. That's where they are. And it might make sense for their own environment, for instance. There may be some growth and development that they're interested in, but there's no reason to believe that they want to develop the same way that our society has developed. So they're not changing at the same time. They're not changing at the same rate. There's no reason to assume that the goal is to grow and change in the same way. We can make arguments that some societies need better access to clean water and health, right? But that they are going to commit to the kind of technological advances that we have, it might not even fit in their cultural values. They may have no interest in some of the things that we do. And then with the growth of, obviously our ability to communicate and our ability to travel, globalization processes mean that it's great that some people are, or some societies are more agricultural and by virtue of their environment stay agricultural because that's their strength, because then we rely on them or we build relationships with them so we can do industrial things or post-industrial things and get our crops from somewhere else. The hope is that societies are doing that in ways that protect both countries' interests. For instance, we know that's not always the case, right? We can argue that we keep other people from advancing by taking advantage of the things that they do, but the goal is again, use that sociological imagination. Step back and think about what position is a person in or a society in based on their own history. And that in that case, based on the relationship of those histories with whatever it is that they're doing in connection with whatever it is that we're doing. So that chapter gives you, chapter 4 gives you a huge amount of information about how societies are changing, that I do believe is worth figuring out or thinking about. But the cool thing is that we've gotten to the point where we can even define what a society is by understanding what culture is. And when we want to try to understand our current society, having some thought about how did we get here? And what are we doing? And why are we doing any of these things? What's next to come for us? And how might that relate to what's next to come for some other society? And how do we relate to them? So a lot of stuff going on in that chapter. There's one more thing that I want to say about that chapter in particular, and I'll do that in another video. Thanks.